You know.
Good evening, and welcome to BCBQ News. I'm Trey.
And I'm Sammy.
And today we will be discussing whether or not the United States has lived up to the Constitution.
In order to do so, we'll be primarily focusing on African Americans from 1789 to the 1920s.
We will be covering topics such as the First World War, the Ku Klux Klan, and even slavery in order to answer this controversial question.
Now to you, Brian.
Thanks, Sammy. To put it quite simply, no. The goals for the U.S. government as outlined in the Constitution were not accomplished by the 1920s for African Americans. Although some civil rights accomplishments were made, such as the abolishment of slavery, overall African Americans remained discriminated against, experiencing many disadvantages in the economy, politics, and in society as a whole. I'll let Gabby in the field give you the details on the first of these examples. Over to you, Gabby.
Slavery was a prevalent issue throughout America from the 18th to the 19th century. Although the Constitution was written to secure the blessings of liberty, slavery was a prevalent example of how America did not reach this goal. Many African Americans were stripped of their freedom as they were taken away from their homes in Africa and forced to serve colonials. Many years later, President Abraham Lincoln passed the 13th Amendment, which still limited the rights of African Americans, and they remained segregated from the rest of society.
After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed his presidency in 1865. Being from the South, he favored Southerners and did little to nothing to support the abolition of slavery during Reconstruction. This prevented the movement from gaining any further progress, causing it to stagnate almost entirely. This was a clear example of how the country as a whole did not establish domestic tranquility, as African Americans continued to be mistreated by the general public and the country faced civil unrest.
Another instance of America's failure to meet the goals of the Constitution, specifically the promotion of general welfare and the existence of hate groups and the racial violence they commit. An example of this is known as the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. Following the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the KKK used fear tactics such as lynchings, murders, and even public meetings to intimidate African Americans from exercising their newfound rights to vote. Sammy?
Many people were members of these hate groups, everyone from general citizens to even local government officials. Widespread corruption and failure to enforce the new constitutional amendments in the southern states of the Union following the Civil War resulted in a complete and utter failure. In the U.S.'s attempt to meet its constitutional goals for African Americans in this regard. Now, Brian will tell you about another example.
Certainly. The First World War is another very prominent reason as to why African Americans were excluded from the supposedly universal constitutional goals and ideals. Upon America's entrance into the war, African Americans were allowed to serve in combat roles. All throughout the front lines, they fought alongside whites, in many cases sacrificing their lives for their country. Upon their return to American soil after the war, however, African Americans found that they did not receive the same respect as those white soldiers who also risked their lives in the name of the American people. This blatant discrimination against African Americans and outrageous inequality is in no way forming the more perfect union that the Constitution states the U.S. government should work towards. In the end, what good is the abolition of slavery if African Americans have to work and pay and live and die under the influence of the same oppression and discrimination as they did burdened by the chains of involuntary servitude?
With all these examples, the United States did not meet its constitutional goals regarding African Americans, and their civil rights were neglected in favor of economic progress and reputation on the world stage. I'm Sammy.
I'm Gabby.
I'm Trey.
And I'm Brian. And join us next week on BCVQ News for a fascinating expose into the world of nukes. Thank you and good night.
Cut.
Good job.
That was the best part.
Try this
Society.
Yeah.
They remain segregated. Not that.
Oh, I can see the sheet music.
Thanks, Sammy.